She said she'd be my pet. But I made her fall in love instead. The auction floor smelled like blood and perfume, a combination that only made sense when you remembered what they were selling. I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't belong among the warlords, the bounty collectors, the corporate freaks with too much money and not enough soul. I was just a technician, a repairman really, barely scraping enough credits to keep my dome cabin lit on the outer edge of Station Morvix. But I had a habit of walking into places I wasn't meant to be, especially when I'd had one too many recycled gin shots and too much silence clawing at my brain. I didn't go there to buy anyone. Hell, I didn't even know what I was doing until they rolled her out in chains. She was kneeling on a display slab like she didn't care what they did to her. Not broken. Not defiant either. Just still, like a beast deciding whether it was worth waking up for its last fight. Her hair was silver white, tangled with dried blood and snow dust, and her ears had that sharp, angled look I'd seen in war reports from the Zarathea campaign. The tail wrapped around her legs was covered in frostburn and matted fur, twitching like it wanted to strike. She wore almost nothing, just a torn pelt wrap barely clinging to one shoulder, showing a body that had been built for war and had lost too much of it. But it was her eyes that wrecked me. Not glowing. Not alien. Just tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep cures. The kind that makes you wonder if the universe has forgotten your name. They called her lot number 76. One of the last surviving female captains of the Virelian vanguard, once known for scorching colonies in retaliation. Her people used to ride plasma dragons and broadcast their kills in 7 dimensions. Now she was being auctioned off like salvage. The man in front of me bid 10,000 credits and licked his lips while doing it. The woman next to him whispered something about breaking her in slowly. I don't remember walking to the front. I don't remember lifting my card. All I remember is the sound of my voice, calm and too loud, saying 35,000. Certified transfer. The room went quiet like a glitch in the system. Someone laughed. Someone cursed. But the gavel hit the slab, and that was it. I had just bought a living weapon with more confirmed kills than my entire home colony had citizens. And the look she gave me when they handed me the leash. It wasn't fear. It wasn't gratitude. It was confusion. Like I was supposed to do something worse than the last one, and she just hadn't figured out what flavor of cruelty I preferred yet. The walk back to my skiff was silent. She didn't resist. Didn't flinch. Just followed, naked feet tracking cold across metal floors, hands bound in front, tail curled around her thigh like a forgotten limb. I wanted to say something. I didn't. What the hell do you say to a creature who once set fire to a starship just to watch the captain scream slower? Hi, I'm Eli, I fix oxygen scrubbers and play old jazz when I'm drunk. Welcome to your new cage. No, I let the silence drag until we were inside the transport. I cut her bindings as soon as the doors sealed. She didn't move. I reached for the console, set course for Sector 9, and only then did she speak. Her voice was raw, deep, like gravel on fire. You forgot the collar. I looked at her. She stared back, expression unreadable. You paid for me. Collar me. I shook my head. You're not an animal. She blinked, like that phrase didn't compute. Then something twisted in her lips. Not a smile. A sneer. Then what am I? I didn't have an answer, so I just handed her a thermal jacket from the side compartment and said, cold. She took the jacket. Not like a gift. Like a weapon she was evaluating. She slipped it on anyway, the oversized sleeves falling over her hands. She looked ridiculous. And she looked beautiful. Not in the way magazines told you beauty worked. Not symmetrical or soft or clean. But like something that refused to die even when the galaxy begged it to. Something carved out of pain and purpose. The skiff hummed beneath us as it broke orbit. I sat across from her, watching her eyes scan every bolt, every seam, like she was already building her escape route. I cleared my throat. What's your name? She didn't answer right away. Then, flatly, does it matter? It does to me. A beat. 2. Then, Vexa. She said it like it meant nothing anymore. Like it had once been a title and now it was just syllables floating in ruins. Okay, Vexa. I'm Eli. That's a weak name. I'm a weak man. That made her blink. Just once. We landed on the edge of Outpost Vireo, a mining sector so forgotten even the smugglers didn't bother with it. My cabin was small. Not poor, just honest. The kind of place with old wood paneling and a heater that whined in protest every time I kicked it awake. I had one bed. One couch. She looked at both like she was waiting for the command. I pointed at the bed. It's yours tonight. Her brow furrowed. You want me there? I shook my head. I want you warm. But I belong to you. You belong to no one. She didn't move. Just stood there, eyes scanning me like a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Finally, she sat on the edge of the bed, slow and calculated. She didn't lie down. Not yet. What do you want from me, Eli? I sat on the couch, leaned back, and closed my eyes. Nothing. Just rest. Silence stretched between us like a tight wire. Then she asked, quieter this time, why did you buy me? I opened one eye. Because the idea of leaving you with him made me sick. She looked at the floor for a long time. You're either very stupid or very kind. Maybe both. That was the first time she smiled. Just barely. But it was there. A flicker. The heater groaned, snow tapped against the side vents, and I let myself drift toward sleep knowing full well that I had invited a killer into my home. But something in my gut said she wasn't here to kill anymore. Not tonight. Not if I gave her something none of the others had bothered with. Not control. Not pain. Just space. Maybe, if I was lucky, that would be enough. Maybe, just maybe, she'd start to believe that warmth didn't always come with chains. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid she'd kill me in my sleep but because my mind wouldn't stop circling the weight of what I'd done, what it meant to bring her here, to give her a place in a home that hadn't seen another soul in years, and in the dark, every soft creak of the heater or shift of her body on the bed across the room sent my senses on edge, not in fear but in awareness, because I was sharing space with something raw and alive and unfamiliar, and there was no telling if she was dreaming of war or calculating how to use my kindness against me. But when I opened my eyes just before morning, I saw her curled under the blanket, breathing slow and steady, one arm draped over her face, the other gripping the edge of the mattress like she didn't trust the softness, and I realized she hadn't taken off the jacket, like maybe it was the only layer between her and the shame she'd learned to wear like armor, so I stayed quiet and let her sleep, even though the air was heavy with questions we hadn't asked and things we hadn't done yet, and when she finally stirred, her eyes opened slow and sharp, and for a second we just stared at each other, the kind of still moment that carries 1,000 unsaid things. Then she sat up, pushing the blanket aside like it was a threat and not a comfort, the oversized jacket slipping off one shoulder and exposing a long scar that ran from her collarbone down across the curve of her breast, and I looked away out of instinct but not fast enough, because she noticed, and her lips twitched with something between amusement and warning as she said, "You can look if you want, I've had far worse eyes on me," and I shook my head and replied, "I'd rather see you than inspect you," which made her pause like no one had ever said that before, and maybe they hadn't, maybe in all the years of being seen as a weapon or a prize or a problem, no one had ever simply acknowledged her as a person, a woman, and not a possession, and when she stood, stretching like a jungle cat uncoiling from hibernation, the morning light caught on the lines of her body in a way that made my chest feel tight, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, but because there was something powerful about the way she didn't care if I was watching or not, something almost sacred in her refusal to be ashamed of her own existence, and when she caught me looking again, this time she didn't tease, she just tilted her head and said, "You still haven't told me what kind of master you are," and I answered without thinking, "I'm not your master," and she stepped closer, slowly, bare feet padding across the floor, the jacket swaying around her thighs, and she asked, "Then what am I doing here?" And I could feel the tension building in the space between us like static, not dangerous but charged with something neither of us could name, and I said, "You're safe here, that's all," and she stood over me now, close enough that I could feel her body heat, close enough to see the faint shimmer of the pale freckles on her neck that looked almost like stardust, and then she crouched in front of me, resting her hands on my knees, staring up at me like a riddle, and she whispered, "I've never been safe, Eli, not really, not even when I was winning," and the way she said my name made it feel like something sacred, like a word she hadn't expected to carry weight but suddenly did, and I placed my hand on hers, gently, slow enough to be rejected, slow enough to ask permission without words, and she didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just let it happen, and that was the first time I noticed she was shaking, barely, just under the surface, like she was holding something back, like she didn't know how to exist in a world where pain wasn't the first language, and I wanted to say something soothing, something smart, but all I managed was, "You don't have to pretend anymore," and she stared at me, long and searching, then said, "Pretending is all I know," and before I could reply, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to mine, and there are moments when silence speaks louder than any scream, and that night the silence between us became something alive, breathing in the shadows, whispering questions neither of us were brave enough to ask. Yet still we moved through it like dancers lost in the rhythm of something ancient and unnamed. When she reached for my hand again, this time it wasn't to test or provoke or claim. It was to hold and to steady. When I pulled her closer, the towel slipped, and she didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She just looked up at me with that same wild fearlessness that had once led armies and set stars ablaze, and she whispered my name. Not like a question this time, but like a statement of fact, something real, something undeniable. I kissed her because I didn't know what else to do, because the universe had stopped making sense long ago. In that kiss, I poured every fragile piece of hope I had left, every lost night and broken promise, every aching quiet morning where I'd woken alone and told myself that was enough. She kissed me back like someone starving for contact, not for sex, not for ownership, but for the raw, messy truth of being touched without expectation. When we broke apart, she didn't say anything, and neither did I. There was too much in the air between us now, and we both knew if we gave it words, it might shatter. So we simply existed there, in that space, heartbeat against heartbeat, until the outside world found a way to crash in, like it always does. It came fast, brutal, without warning. The sirens screamed through the dome wall. The COMM panel lit up with red pulses of emergency override. I ran to it, bare feet slapping cold floor, my mind already spinning through possibilities. She was right behind me, silent and alert, that soldier part of her flickering back to life. When I hit the console, I saw it flashing in capitalized authority script, station rate active. All routes blocked. Evacuate to hard shelter. I cursed out loud before I even finished reading because I knew what this was and who it was for. When I looked at her, she already knew too. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw clenched, and she said only one word, quietly but with absolute certainty, bounty. My gut twisted because I had been careful. No networks, no tags, no record of the purchase, just credits in a dirty backroom transaction. But someone, somewhere, had sold us out. They weren't coming for me. They were coming for her. The worst part was she wasn't surprised, just tired, like she'd been waiting for this. Like kindness had always been borrowed time. I grabbed the emergency pack from under the bed, shoved thermal wraps and rations inside, and told her to get dressed. She didn't move. Just stood there, watching me with something cold growing behind her eyes. I said her name, and she flinched slightly, like she hadn't heard it in a while. Then she walked to the wall panel, opened the supply drawer, and pulled out one of my plasma tools, flipping it in her hand like a blade. I said, "You're not killing anyone," and she said, "I'm not dying for you to stay noble." There was no time to argue because the outer hatch exploded inward a half-second later. We both hit the floor just as a flashbang detonated, filling the cabin with white agony and soundless pressure. My ears rang like sirens as armored boots crashed into the room. 2, 3, maybe 4 of them. Shouting commands that didn't make sense. Visors glowing red. Weapons pointed in all directions. I rolled over just in time to see her move. Not like a person, but like a memory of violence unleashed. Her body was a blur of muscle and reflex as she jammed the plasma cutter into the leg joint of the first soldier, then used his fall to twist and drive his weapon into the next one. By the time I had grabbed my own sidearm, 2 were down, and the third was grappling with her. Her claws dug into his helmet as he screamed. She didn't stop. Not when he begged. Not when he gurgled. Not until he lay still. The last one standing turned to run, but she moved faster. She grabbed him by the back of his suit and slammed him against the wall so hard the metal cracked. When she looked at me, her face was wild, her chest heaving, her arms bloodied. I saw something terrifying in her eyes. Not because she was dangerous, but because she was choosing not to kill him. She dropped him at my feet and said, "Decide." I hesitated too long. She growled and stomped toward the COMM unit while I checked the soldier's vitals. Barely alive. Broken ribs, maybe worse, but breathing. I stared at him and wondered who sent him. Then I heard her voice from the console, sharp and commanding, speaking a dialect I didn't know into a channel I didn't recognize. I asked, "What the hell are you doing?" She looked back at me and said, "Ending this." Before I could protest, the console flared. A new voice replied, one I'd heard only once before on a broadcast from the Central Galactic Court. A voice that belonged to Commander Talix of the Interstellar Trade Enforcement. When he said her name, it wasn't Vexy. It was Captain Corinne. I felt the floor fall out from under me because I suddenly understood what I'd done. I hadn't just bought a slave. I'd rescued the most wanted fugitive in 3 systems. A war criminal. A tactical mastermind who had escaped capture for over a decade. Now she was using my cabin, my beacon, to broker a deal. I shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" She turned her back to me and said something cold and final. "The war isn't over, Eli." I realized she had lied to me. Maybe not about everything, but enough. When she turned off the channel, she didn't look smug. She looked broken, like she'd just torn a piece of herself away. I reached for her. She pulled back and whispered, "You should run now." I said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "You don't know what I am." I replied, "Maybe not. But I know what you're not. And that's a monster." Her lip trembled, just for a second. She whispered, "You're going to die for me?" I said, "Maybe. But I'll die free." That hit her harder than any weapon. She stepped forward, pressed her forehead to mine again, and said, "You stupid human. You don't even know what you've started." I said, "Then tell me." She kissed me, not soft this time, but like fire and gravity and desperation all at once. When she pulled back, she said, "If we leave now, we have 12 minutes before the second wave." I asked, "What happens then?" She said, "They glass the entire sector." I believed her, not because I understood politics, but because I understood fear. She was terrified. That meant it was real. I grabbed the pack, grabbed her hand, and we ran. Through the wreckage of my home. Through snow and smoke and falling ash. The landscape became blurs. The sky above us cracked open with incoming drones. Still, she didn't let go. Neither did I. When we reached the cliffside outpost I had only ever used once to store spare filters, she hacked the door open with a snarl. We crashed inside, sealed it shut, and collapsed on the floor, gasping and covered in blood and snow. For a long time, we didn't speak. There was nothing to say that didn't sound like goodbye. Then finally, she reached for me, her fingers trembling, and said, "Eli, if you want to walk away, I won't stop you." I said, "Vexa, if I was going to run, I'd have done it before you killed a man with my wrench." That made her laugh, just once. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I think you've already ruined me." I replied, "I think we're even." Somewhere outside, the drones passed us by, not seeing what was hiding in the quiet. For now, that was enough. We didn't move for a long time because there was nowhere to go and nothing to say that didn't feel like admitting the obvious, which was that everything had changed and yet somehow stayed exactly the same. I was still just a technician with too many feelings and not enough firepower, and she was still a deadly fugitive curled up beside me like a woman who had forgotten how to sleep without checking for enemies. In the stillness of that storage unit, with its rusted filters, half-broken diagnostics panel, and emergency rations that smelled vaguely of regret, we somehow found the ridiculous humor in it all. I looked down at her and said, "You know this isn't exactly the romantic getaway I had in mind." She snorted against my shoulder and muttered, "Well, if you'd told me you liked death threats and frostbite, I would have picked a different outfit." I raised an eyebrow at her and said, "Actually, I think that towel was working for you." She rolled her eyes, but I caught the faint smile tugging at her lips, and that felt like a victory more valuable than any armistice agreement ever signed. Then, of course, just as things started to feel almost survivable, the heater gave out with a sad mechanical whine. We were left in the kind of cold that creeps into your bones and sets up camp. I scrambled to check the system panel while she watched from her corner with that smug expression of someone who knows exactly how bad it is but is enjoying watching someone else figure it out. I muttered, "This was supposed to be a shelter, not a damn freezer." She replied, "Maybe your definition of shelter includes hypothermia and mild hallucinations." I tossed her one of the thermal wraps with exaggerated flair and said, "Your Highness, your throne awaits." She blinked at me with mock offense and said, "Is this how humans treat war heroes?" I replied, "Only the sarcastic ones." For a moment, it felt like we were playing at being normal people hiding from normal problems. Then my stomach growled loud enough to echo. She tilted her head and said, "Was that a threat or a mating call?" I choked on a laugh and said, "Don't flatter yourself. My mating calls are way more dignified." She smirked and replied, "Oh please, do demonstrate." I said, "Maybe later, when we're not about to freeze our asses off." She leaned back against the wall, wrap pulled tightly around her shoulders, and said, "Well, if we're dying, at least we'll die warmish and entertained." I sat down beside her, letting our legs touch. The contact was electric, not in a dramatic science fiction way, but in a very real someone chose to stay kind of way. I reached into the pack, pulled out the nutrient bars, and handed her one. She sniffed it like I'd just offered her a boot dipped in tar and said, "What flavor is this?" I checked the label and replied, "Optimism and disappointment." She took a bite and immediately made a face like someone chewing a rubber shoe. I said, "Don't worry, it only gets worse from here." She groaned and said, "I used to have chefs, you know. Entire crews dedicated to feeding me, and now I'm stuck with you and your expired bricks." I replied, "You're welcome, Your Majesty," and handed her my jacket when she started shivering again because the wrap wasn't doing much. She looked at me like she wanted to protest but instead pulled it over her shoulders and mumbled, "You're going to make it very hard for me to keep pretending you're just my captor." I replied, "You make a terrible prisoner anyway." She leaned her head against mine and whispered, "Is it always like this with humans?" I said, "Like what?" She paused, then said, "This mess of care and sarcasm and unexpected softness." I nodded and said, "Pretty much." She was quiet for a while before asking if I thought they would track us here. I didn't answer right away because the truth was yes, absolutely. But I also knew this was the only shelter for kilometers, and moving now would get us spotted and vaped by drone patrols. So I said, "No, but we should be ready anyway." She nodded slowly, then said, "If they come, I won't let them take you." I said, I thought I was supposed to be protecting you. She replied, that's your problem, Eli. You keep forgetting I'm dangerous. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, maybe I haven't forgotten. Maybe I just don't care. She leaned in close and said, you really are stupid. I whispered, only for you? Just like that, the heat in the room had nothing to do with a broken heater anymore. She kissed me again, and this time it wasn't desperate or fiery. It was slow and terrifying and so full of meaning that I felt my hands tremble. When we broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine and said, I'm not good at this. I said, neither am I. She laughed softly and said, at least we'll fumble together. Then she yawned, which ruined the moment but also made it perfect. Suddenly, she wasn't the unstoppable warrior or the wanted fugitive. She was just a tired girl in my jacket, leaning against me and trying to stay alive. I pulled her closer. She didn't resist. We sat there like that for what felt like hours until I noticed her tail twitching like it had a mind of its own. I asked, does it have moods? She opened one eye and said, what? I pointed and said, your tail. It's wagging. She stared at it like it had betrayed her and muttered, traitor, under her breath. I lost it laughing. She punched my shoulder and said, shut up. I said, sorry. I didn't know it was sensitive. She covered her face with a wrap and said, I can't believe I'm letting you see me like this. I whispered, I like seeing you like this. She peeked out just enough to glare and say, you're lucky I don't kill people for less. I kissed the tip of her ear and said, then I'm the luckiest idiot in this quadrant. She sighed and said, yes, you are. That was how we survived the first night of hiding, not with weapons or plans, but with humor and exhaustion and the awkward comfort of two people too broken to know how to be normal, but too stubborn to let go of each other. In the morning, when the scanners passed over us again, we stayed still and silent. I counted every second like a prayer. When they finally moved on, she exhaled and said, remind me to stab the next person who knocks on our door. I said, I'll get you a list. She laughed, and that laugh was worth every bruise, every risk, every sleepless moment. It sounded like a future, and I wasn't ready to let that go, no matter how insane this all was. The next morning arrived in silence, not with alarms or crashing boots, but with a soft blue haze of filtered dawnlight seeping through the cracks of the outpost walls, and for a while we didn't move, didn't speak, just breathed together in a quiet so rare it felt like a secret worth keeping, and I wasn't sure if I had dreamed the night before, the laughter, the kiss, the ridiculous moment with her tail, but when I opened my eyes and felt her still beside me, her head on my chest, her fingers curled loosely near my collar, I knew it had all been real, and the weight of it settled over me like something I wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore, and when she stirred, stretching slowly, her skin brushed against mine with a warmth that cut through the cold better than any heater ever could, and she looked up at me with sleep-heavy eyes and said, very softly, you didn't run, and I replied, you didn't stab me in my sleep, and she smiled like that was the most romantic thing she'd heard in years, and when she kissed me this time, there was no fire, no panic, just a slow deliberate softness that made every part of me forget the outside world and its blood and warnings and drone patrols, and I kissed her back because I had nothing else to offer except the truth of my hands, my mouth, and the thousand unsaid things I didn't know how to put into words, and when she pulled me closer, the wrap falling away from her shoulders like silk slipping off memory, I saw her fully in the soft light for the first time, the scars across her side, the delicate shimmer of her skin in the cold, and the quiet in her eyes that wasn't fear anymore, but choice, and I touched her like I was learning a language, slowly, curiously, mapping her reactions with each fingertip, and she let me, not as surrender but as invitation, her breath catching each time I traced the curve of her shoulder or the line of her ribs or the soft underside of her arm where a hidden pulse fluttered like a secret only I was allowed to feel, and she kissed my throat and whispered something in her language I didn't understand but felt down to my bones, something that made me shiver in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and she moved over me with a grace that felt more ritual than routine, like her body had forgotten what it was to be treated gently and was remembering now in fragments and sensations, and when I reached up to cradle her jaw, she pressed into it like it mattered, like that. Small gesture was heavier than anything we'd shared before, and the tension between us finally gave way to motion, slow and steady at first, breath and skin sliding against breath and skin in a rhythm that didn't ask for dominance or submission, only connection, only the simple, maddening desire to be known by touch alone, and her hands roamed my chest with reverence, her lips grazing across my shoulder, my neck, her thighs wrapped around me like vines tightening with each movement, and I couldn't breathe except through her, couldn't think except in the shape of her body against mine, the way she gasped when I kissed the hollow beneath her ear, the way her nails pressed into my back like she needed to hold on or disappear, and we moved together with the clumsy grace of two people who had forgotten what it meant to want and were learning again in real time, and there was nothing theatrical or perfect about it, only the raw unfiltered beauty of limbs entangling in awkward angles, of laughter spilling between moans when we knocked over the emergency pack or hit our heads on the low ceiling beam, and when she pulled the blanket over us and curled against my chest afterward, breath warm against my collarbone. She said, "That was not efficient," and I laughed and said, "No, but it was very human," and she hummed and said, "Then I think I understand your species a little better now," and we stayed like that, not because the moment demanded it, but because nothing else felt real, and when the radio crackled with static from the long-range COMM line, she reached out and shut it off without. The laughter lingered in the air like something sacred, light, and careless in a way that felt impossible given everything we had survived, and for a few precious moments it almost seemed like the war and the bounty and the broken past were just stories we had heard, not lived, and I watched her tie back her glowing hair with a strip of cloth torn from the wrap, still smiling at her own threat to bite me if I misused titles again, and it would have been perfect if not for the low vibration that rolled beneath the floor like a whisper from something far below. Something I shouldn't have noticed but did, because the hum was wrong, not mechanical, not part of the shelter's systems, but older, deeper, like the heartbeat of something buried, and I stood slowly, motioning for her to listen, and when she heard it too, her expression shifted from playful to alert in an instant, because she recognized the sound even before I did, and she whispered a word I had never heard her say before, low and almost reverent, dormant, and I asked what she meant. But she was already moving toward the far wall, the one made of reinforced alloy, the one I had never thought to question because it looked like part of the foundation, but now she ran her hand across its surface, muttering in her native language, and I watched as small symbols began to glow beneath her fingers, patterns I couldn't read but felt in my bones like pressure building before a storm, and I asked again what it was, and she said quietly, "This wasn't just a storage shelter." And when the wall shifted open with a soft hiss and a cloud of ancient air escaped into the room, we both stared at the dark tunnel revealed behind it, descending into the ground like a forgotten throat, and I didn't want to go. I didn't want to lose this moment we had built with skin and warmth and stolen peace, but the look on her face told me this was bigger than us, older than her war, older maybe than either of our worlds, and she said, "If this is what I think it is, we were never hiding in a random outpost. We've been sitting on top of a weapon," and I followed her because there was nothing else I could do, because curiosity and love sometimes wear the same face, and as we stepped into the tunnel, the lights flickered on ahead of us one by one, each pulse illuminating more of the strange alien architecture, not Zerathian, not human, something else entirely, with walls that breathed and hummed and pulsed like veins running through stone, and the air grew warmer as we moved, not in temperature but in presence, like we were entering something that had been asleep for far too long, and I asked her again what she thought this place was, and she said, there were myths, long before the wars, of ancient constructs seated beneath border worlds, sleeping arsenals waiting for the return of their creators, and I said, that sounds like something out of a movie, and she looked at me with fear in her voice for the first time since I'd met her and said, yes, and those stories always end with something waking up. And when we reached the chamber at the end of the corridor, we found a structure that looked almost like a throne but was made entirely of black crystal, its surface etched with fractal lines that shifted when we looked too long, and floating above it, spinning slowly, was a metallic sphere no larger than a human heart, glowing with soft pulses of light that changed colors every few seconds, and Vexa stepped toward it as if in a trance and said, "This is not a weapon," and I said, "Then what is it?" And she reached out a hand toward the sphere and said, "It's a key," and the moment her fingers brushed it, the room exploded with soundless force, not pain but memory, and I collapsed to my knees as images flooded my mind, images of stars dying, of cities burning in glass winds, of creatures older than names watching through black eyes as civilizations rose and fell like flickering embers, and I saw her, not as she was now, but as a child, being led through a corridor like this one, her hand in the grip. We walked back through the tunnel in stunned silence, with the sphere floating behind us like a smug ghost that had just dropped the biggest existential truth bomb in the galaxy and decided to hover around for the awkward aftermath. Neither of us knew what to say, because honestly, what do you say after learning your accidental love story might have been planned 1,000 years ago by some ancient alien matchmaker who thought trauma bonding was a great experiment? Every time I opened my mouth to speak, I remembered something else from the vision: the flicker of her face on a battlefield, the way she had died in my arms in another timeline, or the way I had held her while the stars cracked around us and suddenly, words felt stupid, like trying to explain fire to someone still burning. She kept glancing at me like she wanted to talk too but didn't know how. When we reached the surface again, the hatch slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing the pale frozen light of the wasteland outside. We both stood there blinking like moles climbing out of a dream. Finally, she said the one thing that managed to break the spell by being so wildly inappropriate I almost tripped. She turned to me, dead serious, and said, "I swear, if that thing imprinted our DNA together and I end up laying an egg, I'm going to throw it into the Sunday." I just stared at her for a full 10 seconds before bursting into laughter, not because it was impossible, but because the idea of her laying an egg in my supply crate while swearing at ancient machinery was exactly the kind of weird future I'd probably walk into with her. She grumbled, "I'm being serious," and I said, "I know. That's what makes it worse." She shoved me hard enough that I fell into the snow, and she stood over me, smirking. "That's what you get for bonding with a war criminal," she said. I replied, "I'd do it again." She rolled her eyes and said, "Of course you would. You're a walking consequence." I grinned up at her and said, "And you're my favorite mistake." Her face twitched like she was trying not to smile but failed. When she reached down to pull me up, the sphere buzzed once and she jumped back like it had shocked her. I said, "Okay, maybe don't insult our new glowy orb overlord." She hissed, "It touched me." I said, "Emotionally or physically?" and she shot back, "I will end you." I nodded. "That's fair. But maybe after we figure out where to go next." That shut us both up, because as soon as the adrenaline wore off, we realized we had no shelter, no food, and a very good chance that someone, somewhere, had noticed a dormant alien god key just woke up and was casually following two fugitives through the ice. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Neither of us had a plan beyond "don't die." I asked if she still had that encrypted signal rig from her armor. She nodded. "It only works if I connect it through an old war beacon." I asked, "Do you have one?" She replied sarcastically, "Oh sure, let me pull that out of my tail." I said, "I'd rather you didn't," and she threw a snowball at my face that nearly froze my eyelashes. "Maybe we walk," I offered. "Maybe we freeze," she replied. "Maybe we cuddle," I suggested. "Maybe you lose your other eye," she warned. "Bold of you to assume I had a first eye to begin with," I said. She paused. "Wait, are you blind in one eye?" I shrugged. "No. But if I say yes, will you stop throwing things?" She muttered, "Maybe." That was our entire survival strategy for the next 4 hours, wandering through knee-deep snow in a straight line while trying not to think about destiny, weaponized romance, or glowing sentient spheres with attachment issues. At some point, I realized she was humming a tune I didn't recognize. I asked her about it. "A lullaby," she said. "From my world." I asked, "Was it about war?" She shook her head. "No. It was about a bird that never stopped flying." I said, "That's beautiful." She added, "It eventually died, Wow, okay, thanks for the comfort. She shrugged. The bird got tired. That makes two of us. You never stop talking, do you? Only when you kiss me? She rolled her eyes and kissed me, and I almost forgot how cold it was. I would have kept walking forever just to hold on to that moment if the drone hadn't spotted us. The beam lit up the sky like a blade, and we both hit the snow at the same time. She was already pulling out the small disruptor hidden in her boot, and I was already regretting not bringing more than one ration bar. The drone hovered beyond the ridge, its sensors scanning, targeting array spinning with a red flicker. I whispered, "Tell me you've got a plan." She said, "Yeah. Shoot first." "What's plan B?" I asked. "Duck." She fired. The snow exploded as her shot hit the drone's sensor dead on. It spun out, smoking, and crashed somewhere behind the ridge. "Remind me never to question you again," I said. "Remind me to teach you how to shoot. Remind me why I didn't just stay single. Because your taste is terrible." True. We kept moving, faster now. We had just lit up every bounty net from here to the inner systems. When we finally reached the edge of a ravine, she stopped and pointed to a half-buried structure in the ice. "That's a beacon." "Great, let's activate it." "Great, let's die." "You're bad at pep talks." "I'm bad at lying." We slid down toward the beacon, the sphere still floating behind us like it was watching and judging everything. Once inside, she began calibrating the uplink. I tried not to panic as the interface showed 9 active pings moving toward us. "Hey, not to be that guy, but maybe we hurry." "Don't distract me." "Okay, but I'm about to pee my pants from tension." "If you do, I'm leaving you." "Noted." The console beeped. "I sent a signal," she said. "To who?" "Someone who owes me." "Do they like you?" "They tried to kill me once, so probably not." "This is going to go well." "Shut up." When the sky cracked again with the sound of incoming engines, we both turned. A black stealth ship descended too fast. I asked, "Is that your friend?" She said, "Depends on your definition of friend." "The one that doesn't murder us on sight." "Then no." "Fantastic." I drew the small blaster from my belt, the one I had zero idea how to aim, and stood beside her anyway. I had made my choice a long time ago, and if destiny wanted to throw more nonsense at us, I was going to meet it standing next to the girl who once threatened to lay an egg in my toolbox. When the ship touched down and the hatch opened, I held my breath. I had no idea if this was the end, or another beginning. She looked at me and said, "Well, if we die, I'm glad you got to see me naked first." I said, "Same." She smiled. "Idiot." I nodded. "Yours." And the first figure stepped out into the light. The first figure stepped out into the light, tall and armored in a matte black exosuit with crimson stripes cutting across the chest plate like war paint, and the way Vexa stiffened told me everything I needed to know about how personal this was going to get. She didn't speak at first, just stood there staring, jaw clenched, every muscle in her body tensed like a cord drawn tight, and the woman in the armor stopped a few feet from us, removed her helmet, and revealed a face so similar to Vex's. I thought for a terrifying second I was hallucinating, but this woman's features were sharper, colder, like a version of Vexa who had never learned to smile, and when she spoke, her voice was lower and controlled. "So this is what you fell into, sister?" And Vexa didn't answer, not right away, just blinked once and said, "Tira," and I realized then that this wasn't just a former ally or commander or rival, this was blood, and suddenly the air between them turned electric with all the years of silence and betrayal and choices that had led them here. I stepped forward instinctively, but Vexa held out a hand without looking and said, "Stay behind me," and I said, "I'd rather not get shot by your family," and she replied, "It would be a mercy compared to what she has in mind," and Tira looked at me then, really looked, her eyes scanning me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve, and she asked, "Is this him? The human? The anomaly?" And Vexa nodded once and said, He's not the anomaly. We are. And Tira's gaze sharpened. You activated the chamber. And I said, yes. Hello, I'm Eli, apparently Cosmic Fate's favorite technician. Nice to meet you. And she ignored me entirely and focused back on her sister. Do you know what you've done? And Vexa said, I gave them what they wanted. I proved it could be done. And Tira shook her head slowly. You proved their design is still active, and now they will come. And that word hung in the air like a storm front, heavy and ancient and filled with implications I couldn't yet comprehend. I asked, who's they? And both women spoke at once, the architects, and that meant nothing to me except that it clearly meant everything to them. And I said, are we talking old gods or angry scientists? And Tira said, both. And I muttered, of course. And Vexa turned to me and said, we need to leave this planet now. And Tira said, you're not going anywhere, and raised a weapon from her hip, sleek and humming with power. And I froze because I'd seen that kind of tech before, once, in a black market vault that was later vaporized when someone sneezed too hard near the trigger. And Vexa didn't move, just stared at her sister and said, if you shoot him, you'll destroy everything this project was meant to be. And Tira said, that's exactly the point. And I said, okay, look, I know I'm just the emotionally vulnerable meatbag in the middle of your intergalactic soap opera, but maybe we don't do the murder thing today. And that got a flicker of a smirk from Vexa, which was all I needed to step closer and place a hand on her back. And Tira's eyes narrowed like she couldn't believe the audacity. And I said, you're scared, aren't you? Not of us, but of what it means that it worked, that someone built something stronger than your control. And she aimed the weapon directly at me and said, you have no idea what you're talking about. And I said, I don't, but I know what I feel, and I know that whatever this is, whatever the architects built or wanted or left behind, it wasn't meant to end with blood, it was meant to begin with choice. And Vexa whispered, he's right, and stepped in front of me, shielding me with her body. And Tira hesitated, just a blink, but it was enough. Enough for the sphere to rise between us and emit a deep resonant hum that vibrated through our bones and filled the air with golden light. And Tira stumbled back, weapon falling from her hand, clutching her head as the hum grew louder, not painful, but piercing in a way that made it impossible to think about anything but what UTR.